Good morning. My name is Max Rizzuto. I'll let Alyssa actually introduce herself as well.
Alyssa.
We're both research assistants at the DFR lab, and today we're going to be teaching you how to create a social science data set and sort of walking you through the processes that we took when we created our own. This is sort of a complicated process, but it's easily boiled down into something that's easy for you to apply to your own research. We'll sort of workshop some of these problems and see how they can apply to your field later on. So while we're going over the presentation, just keep in mind like how some of the things we're talking about might apply to your own research as well.
Yeah, and to start with some definitions, just so we're all on the same page. Social science data is both quantitative and qualitative data that pertains to the humanity fields. So when we're talking about social science coding, we're not talking about computer science coding in, say, Python or Java. We're actually talking about acquiring data by having people called coders label data according to certain attributes which we're interested in learning more about. So typically social science data sets are made in academia, but we're not in academia, we're both at a think tank, and we made a data set using similar principles. And one thing to note is if you're using data that has people's sensitive personal information, you'll want to go through an ethics process to make sure it's okay to collect. So in the US, it's called the IRB approval, or Institutional Review Board approval. But the problem we specifically focused on, political disinformation campaign, didn't have any sensitive information, so we didn't have to deal with that. This is a table of contents, so this is what we'll cover in our workshop. And yeah, let's get started. So first, we're kind of going to do an overview. This is the project we worked on, and this is where we're drawing our experiences from. It's called the Dichotomies of Disinformation. Our think tank specifically focuses on identifying and exposing disinformation. So we worked with our colleague Emerson Brooking, as well as collaborators at Jigsaw, which is Google's internal think tank. And few efforts have been made to define, classify, and catalog political disinformation campaigns systematically. So our goal with this project was to create a system to compare and categorize such disinformation campaigns. And to that note, to that end, we developed a framework to catalog each campaign, and we ended up using 151 variables and 2 coders, which were me and Max. And we coded each example of a political disinformation campaign according to the variables we delineated. And we tracked something called intercoder reliability, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. And the end result was a data set of 60 cases and a code book which delineated and organized discrete and significant cases of disinformation in a framework which makes it easy to document past, present, and future occurrences. So on the left-hand side, you'll see this is the final product. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see this is part of the code book, which we'll talk more about soon. So one of the first things to know is that you have to have a problem. Now that we've gone through the final product and the problem that we were identifying, which was political disinformation campaigns and how to catalog, we're going to kind of walk through the steps that we took to make our social science set and steps that similar projects will need. So I think some good questions to answer are, does this data set already exist? If you already have the data, you're done. And does the subject that you're specifically looking at warrant its own data set? This is a really long process. So asking yourself if something already exists will save you time. And in looking at projects that already exist, it's important to identify, okay, this similar project had this failure and this shortcoming, but this success. What can I do differently, et cetera, et cetera. We even talked, in making our project, we even talked to people who made similar projects to ask them if they thought what we were doing made sense, if it was something that would add new information to the field. Social science data is very different than other types of data in that you are in part creating it yourself. So you need to make it work with all the variables you're interested in capturing. You then use this framework to make a code book, which lists all the variables and has specific definitions for each of the variables. There are a couple of things to keep in mind here. You want to be realistic. You want to make sure that you're granular enough to capture specific discrete data instances, but you're not so granular that you're spending hours and hours on, a single data point. When we did this, we had a hierarchy of variables. So we started kind of asking ourselves, okay, a political disinformation campaign, what is it really made of? And we decided, okay, there's a target. It's on a specific platform. Content, there's specific content that is used. They have different methods and an attribution, who's doing it. So we use those 5 top-line categories to create a hierarchy of variables, which you can see on the right-hand side here for target. We started with nation of origin, and for every single variable, we had a pretty specific definition. We wanted to make sure that people who, weren't us could look at our code book and see that it all made sense to them. So we wanted each definition to be really readable. We also used a lot of different variable types. So we didn't just do text inputs. We also did binaries. We did different quantitative data as well. So we were able to capture a range of options. And that's what that code book looks like actually in our data process. So here's another example. We had to spend a lot of time revisiting and redoing these definitions. So for example, astroturf, we defined as artificial consensus building, inflation, or amplification. Originally, we had it as a Potemkin village, which is a really niche phrase and doesn't apply to all circumstances. And we realized while doing the coding that this wasn't going to be helpful to people who didn't know our data as well. So we changed the definition and realized it applied to more stuff.
So, intercoder reliability. Basically, Alyssa and I went through the process of coding all of the cases twice, essentially. And we wanted to be able to understand how well the coders did relative to each other and relative to the data at large. So in validating our data and taxonomy, we applied this intercoder reliability, wherein Alyssa and I would apply the rules specified in the code book to each of the cases that were decided through their own process of case selection. We would add them to the set and then record the data points of agreement and discord for both a given variable section throughout the hierarchy of the code book. So the idea is that the coders who struggle to agree on a variable, or the variables where the coders struggle to agree or find a consensus in the definition, would then become a reflection of actually the definition and not so much the coders, and would lead to iteration of the taxonomy in the code book at large. This sort of helped us identify weak points as we iterated in early stages, and then ultimately evaluate the successes of our project later on.
And I'd add that intercoder reliability, which is also called inter-rater reliability in statistics, is really important because it indicates that your work is replicable, so that 2 people who are seeing the same, in our case, disinformation campaign, will label it in the same ways. And this is really helpful, especially if you're afraid that the way you're labeling your data is too subjective, because it minimizes the chance of errors and increases the overall reliability of your data.
So in achieving our goal of collecting all of this data and then also evaluating the success of it, and if you see on the screen here, this is just a video of the coding process that Alyssa and I would go through, and I'll explain it as well. Our initial coding took the form of just sort of manual entry into a Google Sheet, which would then be compared to a second Google Sheet for discord and congruence, as well as reconciliation, right? So when the coders would not agree about something, that would go upstairs to our colleague Emerson, who would then look at the cases and say, okay, I see where the failure is. Let's convene and discuss the definition that led to this sort of lack of understanding here. So the video that you're watching now is a later version, and ultimately what became our final version of our coding process and sort of data collection schema, which took the form of Google Forms associated with a Google Sheet that would dump the data into a Google Sheet where data could be reconciled easily and intercoder reliability could be evaluated automatically. So I'm not going to go into the technical stuff of this too much because you guys don't care, and that's not what this is about. But this is the innermost loop of my project. Well, really, this is the whole thing of our Google Sheets data pipeline, if you will. The final internal loop in the very most center here, you can see is the innermost loop where my values are compared to Alyssa's, and if there's discord, then it goes into one sheet, and if Emerson clarifies it, then it goes into the final. But that's neither here nor there. There's already pre-built tools, I'm sure, but this was within our price range and within reach. So if you're curious and have any Google Sheets questions, I'd be happy to answer.
So once you have a specific problem that's narrow enough in scope and there is added value in creating a data set, and then once you've made a code book and a data collection process, you'll want to start labeling some data and doing the work. Unfortunately, you probably won't be done here. We found that we had to cycle through several sets of code books with very slightly differing definitions because we kept running into data it was hard to define or wasn't captured in our framework or that we just hadn't anticipated. We wanted to make sure that our code book applied to as many different types of political disinformation campaigns as possible. So by doing example data sets and refining our code book, we were able to come up with new variables, change definitions that weren't working, and figuring out what was too time consuming and too granular and what was too broad and too vague to apply. So this is a meme of the process basically, and this was the bulk of the work, I would say. We went through 4 or 5 different code books, several sets of data that we ultimately ended up throwing out because it was just practice to test the taxonomy and all the variables we had in as many different iterations as we could.
In its earliest versions, sort of to get the ball rolling and mark the challenges of success, we borrowed verbiage from military disciplines. So attacker and target later became disinformant and target, and means and ways later became methods and techniques. For a number of reasons, right? Like military lingo isn't necessarily as accessible to many people. So that's not necessarily the demographic that our project was made for. So if your language or if your data set is meant to apply to a specific discipline, then you should probably use language that's familiar to that discipline as well. Also, in kind of scaling down that use of language, we decided to ditch attacker from the codebook because it sort of inferred some level of confidence and attribution if you're attacking, rather than just saying you're attributing the campaign to an object, right? A data point. So it was decided that that term sort of accompanied a preconceived understanding that would affect the perception of the data. This is day 2 of DataFest, so I'm sure you guys have all seen plenty of visualizations by now. But we'll just touch on ours briefly and leave you with some thoughts from it. Once your data is all sorted, visualization plays a crucial role in making the content accessible and the findings clear to, not only yourself, but to a broader audience. So as you can see, this video on the left is also from the interactive map that was published in Jigsaw's Current. You also saw one earlier about it. And to our right, you can see the dichotomies of disinformation found on our GitHub page. github.com/dfrlab/dichotomies of disinformation. It's important to remember that data visualization is a super rigorous process and a really easy way to misrepresent your data. So for instance, our data set provided like considerable evidence to suggest like a high level of correlation between Russian attribution and the United States being a target. And while it's fair to say that Russia engages in a fair bit of global disinformation, that was a reflection of our data. That correlation that existed there was a reflection of DFR lab reporting and our case selection process. So there are takeaways that you can get from the dichotomies of disinformation, but to suggest that like our data represents a global percentage that isn't weighted in some capacity would be a misuse or misrepresentation of the data. And that definitely is something that we consider when making the visuals. I'll probably leave it there because visuals have been discussed here before, but I'm going to name drop Edward Tufte's book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information, highly recommended.
There's some other questions to ask. Making a social science data set won't be appropriate in all contexts, and it's a really big commitment to take on. So there's lots of questions you should ask yourself. I think particularly funding, of course, is always an issue. One thing that was really helpful for us was the acronym SMART. So was our project specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound? And by that, we really meant like, is the project well-defined, clear, and unambiguous? Do you have specific criteria that will measure your progress towards the accomplishment of your goal? Is the whole data set attainable? Are you making realistic expectations for what you can produce in a given time period? And do you have a start and end date and a specific and doable time set?
If I could just hop in and add real quick, Alyssa, that this time-bound acronym here is one that I think is super important. And as Alyssa and I have both moved on to make other like data sets for internal purposes at the DFR lab, having gone through the process of coding 60 plus cases essentially twice, really have grown to understand what 150 variables looks like for a coder who needs to read a long article and then evaluate its meaning and how it pertains to this niche topic of interest. Making it time-bound is super important. I think personally, it would end up taking me about 45 minutes, sometimes more, to code a single case. So just to give you an idea of why we think funding is an important aspect of this as well.
Yeah, and for our time, we set I think, December as our goal, and then it took a month longer. So it was tough. Okay, so before we go into workshop time, I wanted to kind of summarize what we've just talked about and then open it up to questions, and then we'll describe the workshop prompt. So basically, we've covered having a specific and narrow problem that does not currently have its own data set, developing a framework of variables and definitions for those variables, and making a code book that you can apply to your data, tracking intercoder reliability, figuring out a method of data collection, iterating on your framework and code book and data until you're at your desired level of specificity. So those are the steps we've just covered. We're going to do 10 minutes of workshop time. So think about a specific problem in your field of study, since I know there's people at DataFest from lots of different fields, not just disinformation. And think about a data set that you might want in your day-to-day work. How would you kind of go about this process we've underlined to create your own social science data set? And would it be appropriate to do so? Is there already a data set you can use instead? And once you have a specific topic, how would you begin applying a taxonomy that's robust and cohesive enough to apply to all of your data? So what are some starting variables you would use? And if you can't think of a specific topic, we have some optional prompts. So election reporting and political memes are two things we're working on here at the DFR lab. but tree, charcuterie, cheese, thinking about how a taxonomy and framework can apply to lots of different data scenarios is helpful. Okay, let's regroup. Does anyone want to share the problem they were thinking of in their field where a social science data set might apply or might not apply, or taxonomy ideas?
I can go.
Sure.
Yeah, because I'm interested in I suddenly came to a problem, so I'm interested in what you think. I was just thinking about cataloging the visual language of information graphics on social media that are posted by official statistic offices. And then I kind of thought about, that you could describe each information graphic, the parts of each information graphic. There would be maybe different styles that you could kind of use to describe the chart style and the chart type as well. But then I kind of felt like, okay, then I have this, then I just know what kind of information graphics are there. I just have this catalog that describes them, but how would I kind of describe the value of them? Would I need to kind of do more user testing, or like wouldn't I need like a second data set that kind of evaluates that catalog and what it actually means? Did you have like this kind of?
Yeah, that's a great question. Max, do you want to go first or should I?
Yeah, I'll take it. So that's a super interesting topic. And yeah, you'd certainly need another data set to talk about things things like the substance of the graphics and the visuals that you're talking about. You could also talk about features and aesthetics. So is it a pie chart? Does it feature a line graph? Does it have an axis that's based off of time or an axis that's based off of the volume? What is, even colors decidedly chosen, right? If it's a political one and they use colors, then that can probably say a lot about it, about your set. Also, if this is something that you've looked into, I've also kind of considered things similar to this, and I'd recommend you check out TS&E maps. This is not social science coding, I'm sorry, but check out a TS&E map. They're very cool.
Okay.
Alyssa, I'll leave that for you.
Yeah, and I would add, one thing that was super helpful for me while doing the political disinformation campaign was kind of thinking like, okay, if I was explaining this to a friend who had no idea what disinformation was, had no idea what a campaign was, had no idea what any of my cases were, what variables would be helpful for them to get a descriptive idea of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have other ideas they were workshopping or taxonomies?
Yeah, so I had a question about conducting coding analyses, but based on interviews, because I'm starting a project on the impacts of COVID-19 on people who have substance use disorders, and we're trying to conduct qualitative interviews to assess the impact, as well as quantitative data analysis, which is what I'm more used to. So I was wondering if you have any advice on conducting interviews and how to code interviews and things like that, because I'm not really experienced with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess first would be, since they're interviews with real people, you'll have to get probably IRB approval if you're in the US, or go through an ethics process in some way. But once you've done that, you can use 2 coders like we did here, and come up with a list of variables that will apply to every single interview. Of course, every interview will be different. So say, like, even binaries that say, okay, well, this interview didn't include a substance abuse disorder that was 5 years or more. So yeah, that's what I would say. Max, what do you have to add?
I think that it would be a good idea to go through a IRB or equivalent approval process, regardless of like where you are actually. Just for the process, I think like getting it into like academic publishing, that's sort of a barrier that they mandate, and that can actually turn out to be kind of a complicated process, but I think it's worth doing.
We
Um,
already have IRB approval, just letting you know. Yeah.
that's awesome. Yeah. Okay. So that's good. That's other than that. I mean, there's some interesting tricks that you can do with data, and this is actually something that Alyssa shared with me. Sort of mapping subjective data points. So, Alyssa, do you know what I'm referencing? The 0 to 9 and goes to, or like
Yeah.
1 to 9. Do you care to explain that?
Yeah, sure. So sometimes I think particularly with surveys and when you're interviewing people, you want to gauge how people feel on a certain topic. So you can include more subjective questions, like, for example, do you like or despise cheese? And then you can do, say, a 1 to 9 scale, where 1 is I love cheese and 9 is I hate cheese. And then participants can put where they feel about cheese from 1 to 9. And then you have 2 levels of granularity there. So you can either analyze the data using all 1 through 9 numbers, or you can divide it. So, okay, 1 through 3 is going to be people who mostly love or like cheese. 4 through 7 is going to be people who are kind of ambivalent. And then the highest number is people who really despise it. So there's, yeah, different tricks like that that I would add are helpful.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
So I did cheese. I was going to do charcuterie, but I think that charcuterie is sort of a trick question here because it's kind of too broad to get. Well, it's not necessarily too broad, but for my interest in cheese, I wanted to narrow it down to get subjective data points that are not already captured necessarily. So there's the quantitative measures that I started with. I'm thinking, how long has the cheese aged? What kind of milk is it made from? Is it a plant-based cheese, right? And then I was thinking, should I do like region of origin, or like has this cheese come from a nation specifically? And then I thought why that might not be a great idea, and I came to the conclusion that it's possible that the same qualities found in a cheese could be realized in different cultures and in different nations, right? But have very much in common. So that might not be a great top line variable because it would separate my cheese too early on in the taxonomy. So then I went on to subjective measures, and I'm thinking, okay, what doesn't already exist if I type in like, I mean, this is all exists, right? But you can find out the age because that's a quantitative measure, and you can find out where it comes from because that's an objective fact, right? But let's say something like fragrance. Do I want to map the intensity? And if so, I probably want to take like an average from the coders, right? Because people might map it separately or differently, have a different perspective on that. Other things could be aroma, right? So could chart not only the intensity, but sort of notes possibly, just spitballing. Other ideas that I was thinking about were possibly charting like the moisture of the cheese, something that like would be a reflection of whether the cheese was hard or soft. And then I was thinking a cheese can be soft and still be brittle. So maybe that's another section, right? Like feta sort of crumbles, but it's a soft cheese. So these are just things to think about, social science.
Great. And so another example that actually already exists perfectly is trees, right? Trees are something that already have a very specific taxonomy. So like order, family, genus, species. But if we wanted to make our own and maybe weren't aware that this taxonomy existed, I think we would start with, okay, well, what's the definition of a tree? Am I looking just at trees or shrubs, I would have to define a tree as something specific. And then I would say, well, what are my variables? I'm interested in the bark. I'm interested in the leaves. I'm interested in whether or not it flowers. I want to know whether it's annual, an annual grower or not. And trees is way too vague. So I would have to narrow down the scope of my project to say, I'm only going to look at Northeastern American tree species. And then I could go from there.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.